Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, a daily podcast brought to you by the Takshashila Institution. I am your host for today, Wini, Communications Manager here. We are witnessing a defining test for India's foreign policy, caught between the military pressure from China and the economic pressures from the US. New Delhi's strategy of non-alignment is under extreme pressure. So today we examine the breaking points of India's strategic balancing act in a deeply polarizing world. And to discuss this, I have with me Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, who was a former national security advisor to the Prime Minister of India and is currently a visiting professor at Ashoka University. Hi, Ambassador Menon.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So to begin with, India's policy of strategic autonomy has historically allowed it to operate between major power blocs, but the confluence of the 2025 US tariffs targeting Indian exports and the continued costly military standoff with Beijing, it presents a severe challenge, right? So given these intense and simultaneous pressures, how long realistically can New Delhi maintain its non-aligned pivot point before the intensifying US-China rivalry forces an irreversible choice towards a more rigid aligned security and economic framework? And what is the core metric or event that could actually signal the point of no return for this policy?
In fact, the way I see it, it's not so much a point of no return as more proof of the need for such a policy. Because what are the alternatives? The alternatives are, as you said, to choose between either China or the US, but neither of them is offering India an alliance, nor have they ever offered one. And I don't think India has ever so far, it's faced much more difficult choices in the past, and it's never had to actually choose between the partners. It never has. I think part of the problem in the way that we frame the issue is that strategic autonomy actually doesn't mean that you don't act or that you don't engage with other people. It means that you have the choice of engaging and that you choose whom and when you engage, and you do that on the basis of your interests. So it's not some balancing act or pivoting act. It's not, I'll be equidistant between these powers. No, I will work with the powers when it's in my interest. But I will work with all powers, and these will not be exclusive relationships. Secondly, that it is non-alignment in the sense that I am not automatically tied into any alignment or alliance which will determine what I will do. Why is that? Very simple reason. There's no other power on earth which shares our interests 100%. So why would I hand over the decision on how I engage to anybody else if they don't share my interests? And the troubles that you mentioned just now, whether it is the trouble on the border, the crisis on the LAC with China, or whether it is the tariffs that President Trump is using to try and change India's behavior, saying stop buying Russian oil, for instance, these troubles actually only prove the need for more strategic autonomy. Because otherwise you would have no choice but to bend with the wind with whoever you went with. So I don't see any alternative to strategic autonomy. In fact, I see this situation as stressing the need for strategic autonomy. You look at the effect of the US tariffs on India. In the last quarter, our exports to the US are down, and yet our total exports in many of the products that used to go mainly to the US, marine products, gems and jewelry, etc., are actually up because we found alternate markets. The whole world is doing a readjustment of its trading policy, and the entire global trading system is undergoing a fundamental change because the US has moved away from MFN to a system of bilateral, tariff-led, and discriminatory, actually, arrangements between partners depending on its geopolitical and other whims and fancies. So as the system readjusts, we will have to readjust, and that's something you need autonomy to do. You can't adjust to fundamental changes like that if you're part tied to somebody else and some group or alignment or whatever is making the decisions for you. So for me, actually, this is not a moment which actually drives you away from strategic autonomy. It should drive you to more autonomy, but it also drives you to more engagement because you will have to act. And that means you will have to look for partners across the board, different issues, different partners, but you will work with whoever you can to further your interests.
So if we talk about economic dependency, right, the data, as you can see, is sharp. India's trade deficit with China has soared up to nearly $100 billion in 2025, which is cementing China's position as its top trading partner and supplier of critical inputs, let's say from APIs and electronics to rare earth magnets. So to what extent does this deep structural economic dependency on China limit India's freedom of maneuver and its ability, to act as a full and unconstrained partner to the US in the Indo-Pacific? Does the economic reality essentially place a ceiling on the strategic ambition of the Quad itself, or is it possible to compartmentalize a security-driven Quad relationship from a more commercially dependent economic reality indefinitely?
I think there are limits to the extent to which economic dependence, interdependence, whatever links can translate into strategic or geopolitical action and behavior. And this works both ways, both in terms of, Britain and Germany were the most economically interdependent countries on earth in 1914, and yet they ended up fighting each other in a world war on opposite sides, right? So economic interdependence, A, doesn't stop conflict, geopolitical conflict. B, the limits of economic interdependence as a factor of influence are also very clear. You look at China's behavior over the last 10 years or so. She has applied economic sanctions to the Philippines, to Japan, to Australia. I mean, the list is very long. Norway, I can give you a long list. And Canada, etc., etc. None of them have changed their behavior substantially as a result. Their behavior remains much the same. And ultimately, those economic sanctions were wound down, with some face-saving formulas found for this. So I think we tend to overestimate dependence. When we talk of dependence, look at how dependent China is on the US and the Western capitalist economy. China imports 25% of her food from the rest of the world. China depends on the world for intellectual property. She imports 6 times the IPs that she exports. She depends on the world for energy. Does that mean that, therefore, she has to listen to what the US tells her? Even though it is still primarily a Western capitalist-led economy that she's part of. And yet, we still speak of China and the US as rivals. So I think we overdo this argument, this linkage between economic dependence or interdependence or whatever you want to call it, and the effect that it has on your geopolitical and other behavior. If you think of India in the 50s, when we were practicing a non-aligned policy, we were economically, all our weapons came from Britain, and economically we were tied to the Western markets for our survival, in fact, for a long period. And we were probably in an economically much weaker position than we are now, today. It didn't stop us from acting independently or being a non-aligned country. So I think, yes, I know that most people think, but that means that doesn't mean that China can tell you what to do. I think this is exaggerated. A lot of it is in your own mind and how far you let that affect you.
So when we talk about organizations, right, India currently holds a membership in two seemingly antithetical geopolitical structures. One is the Quad, and the other often anti-Western blocs like the BRICS and SEO. So how does India successfully reconcile its security commitments and deep military exercises within the Quad framework with its active participation in BRICS and SEO summits, which include, Russia and China? And does this dual presence strengthen India's status by maximizing leverage, or does it, weaken its credibility with both sides by signaling a lack of true commitment to either ideological camp, if I may?
Well, I think both sides will tell you that because they want to drag you into their camp. So they will tell you that this affects your credibility and, you should actually commit to us. We are the right ones. The fact is, as I said at the beginning, that none of them share your interests 100%. Russia and China are anti-West. India is non-West. India, like South Africa, like Brazil maybe, is non-West in that sense. Brazil is maybe more Western, but that doesn't mean we can't work with the West or with the US. But the same thing with the US. We don't have 100% congruence of interest with the US. The US is an advanced country with global reach, with global interests, not all of which we share. And you've seen it in policy over and over again. So we work with them to the extent that it's possible to work together to the extent that it matches our interests. And whether it's BRICS, whether it's Quad, whatever it is. In any case, frankly, the talk of Quad being an anti-China military security organization is overdrawn. Quad has actually been very careful in what it does. It has concentrated on providing a few global public goods. It doesn't go around patrolling the sea lanes. It exercises together in case there are contingencies that would require or that Quad members would choose to respond to. That's about all. I know the Chinese build it up by saying, oh, it's a nation, NATO in the making, and so on. But I think that's an exaggeration. You must expect both sides in this, the US, China. They will both say, oh, your credibility gets affected. Oh, you should come to our side and, this is your natural home. The Chinese will say the same to you, that you are part of the global south and, the US is a superpower. It has no interest. It's a hegemon. You need to work with us. But the fact is that we have a certain congruence with both. After all, with China, who are the biggest importers of oil from the Middle East, who therefore depend on the safety and security of the sea lanes in the Indian Ocean. China, India, Japan, Korea. Now you have Quad members there, you have BRICS members there, and yet on other issues, on cybersecurity, for instance, you'll have a completely different set of partners who you work with. So it's how you choose to use these things. You use each forum for your interests. And you don't have to feel ashamed that, other people like one forum or prefer another, or they think that and none of them today, in today's world, can be said to be ideologically aligned or organized. So for me, this is natural behavior in a disorderly world. In a world where, frankly, there is no world order operating. And that's not such a bad thing, by the way. It's the norm in history. In that kind of world, you pursue your interests any which way you can with whoever you can. And if there are plurilateral organizations like this, use them.
So, the current US approach appears to demand alignment from India, specifically on containing China and, adhering to sanctions on Russia, while also deploying a trade measure such as the 2025 tariffs, which are perceived by some in New Delhi as an infringement on India's economic sovereignty. So is this US strategy fundamentally misaligned with India's core sovereignty-first doctrine? And if so, is this specific miscalculation, expecting alignment and imposing penalties, inadvertently creating the very conditions that compel, New Delhi toward a more pragmatic dialogue and tactical rapprochement with Beijing, thereby undermining the core US strategic goal in Asia?
You seem to believe that there is a coherent US strategy towards India and the world at this moment? I am not so sure, if you ask me to describe it. And frankly, because when you look at US behavior vis-a-vis India, the kinds of steps that they've taken, many of them have actually hurt US interest as much as they've hurt our interest. And they have certainly destroyed the credibility of the US as a partner in India. I mean, there is widespread disillusionment with the idea. And it, more important than trust or credibility, for me, the problem is that your assumption is that the US will follow their own interests, and it need not always be the same as us. But you assume that they will do so in a rational and self-enlightened manner. That is no longer true. There is no, at least to my mind, I haven't seen a defense saying that US tariff policy now actually serves US interests. It certainly doesn't serve the US consumer. It doesn't serve the world trading system. And it means that other people will now find other ways of doing their business without the US. So I don't see, so unless you can assume that the US is rational, has a coherent policy, as you seem to believe, I'm not so sure. There's an analytical problem here with the policies of the Trump administration, the second Trump administration. You know, we assume that states are rational, logical, and follow coherent policies. But what we're seeing is neither rational nor logical and nor coherent. Policy seems to change every day and seems to depend on other things, on other factors like ego and whatever. So how can you make sense of nonsense? That's the analytical problem here. So I'm very careful to say, you know, the US is going through a phase. They are sorting their own politics out among themselves. This is a very different US from anything we've known before. The old liberal globalist coalition, which existed and used to run the blob, let's say, or the used to run US foreign policy, that is no longer in power, and that old political coalition is gone. But what's going to come, we don't know, because they're still in a transitional mode. But it's clear that something basic has shifted, because between Trump 1 and Trump 2, we had Biden. What policies did he change? Not much. Certainly not policy towards India, towards China, all that. Biden did exactly what Trump 1 had done. And much of what Trump 2 is even doing today is a continuation of what started in President Obama's time, taken to the extreme. So I think we need to be a little careful before we jump to a conclusion. Fact is that the US remains the world's largest economy, is a very important country for us if we want to transform India. It's as an economic partner, but also is still a huge geopolitical actor in the world. And therefore, we will work with it. We will see what we can do with it. The US might keep saying things, changing things, impose 50%, say we'll do a trade agreement tomorrow, but then not do it, etc. That's all right. I think we just have to accept that there's much more unpredictability in US policy, and then we take it as it comes. But we have to keep our eye on the ball. Our interest is India's interest. That's it. And I don't think we should make the mistake of analyzing or ascribing rationality and logic to something that is no longer so. Because it itself, the US itself, is in the midst of a transition. Some things are clear. I mean, the traditional idea of the West is gone. The West as a unit, as a geopolitical unit, and its influence, that is gone, clearly. The US also will not be the kind of power that she was before. All that is clear. But where she's going, how far she's going, and whether we should therefore jump to big conclusions and plan long-term policy towards the US, I'd be very careful before I did that.
So, following years of border friction, there has been a visible diplomatic thaw between New Delhi and Beijing, which was highlighted by high-level engagement like the 2025 Modi-ji meeting and the resumption of direct flights, right? So, from Beijing's strategic perspective, is this thaw primarily a genuine attempt to de-escalate and stabilize the volatile border, let's say LAC, or is it a short-term tactic designed solely to complicate or just distract and ultimately weaken the momentum of the growing US-India strategic partnership? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think you can say conclusively either way now. But the fact is that 5 years after what happened in Galwan, we have still not actually resolved the crisis. And the entire LAC is actually alive still. We still have 100,000 troops up on that border, both sides together on the western sector in Ladakh. So I think it's far too early to say that A, it's been resolved, or that we know which way it's going, that this is short-term tactical or this is long-term settlement. And for me, the sad part is when you compare this with what happened in 86 when Sundarungchu, Wangdong, we had a similar face-off. Within 2.5 years from that, we had managed to actually arrive at a new modus vivendi. Rajiv Gandhi visited China. We came to an agreement. We actually managed to put in place military CBMs, ways of handling these things. So we actually used the crisis as an opportunity to find solutions and manage the problem. This time, 5 years on, we have not managed to do that. Now, I'm not saying who's responsible, whether it's China, whether it's India, I have no idea. But the fact is that unlike the past, we have not responded to crisis the way we used to in the past, and we haven't shown the same skill and dexterity that we did. So I think it's too early to say, oh yeah, this is just a tactical adjustment, or that, oh no, they're both determined to actually make some real progress. I would hope that they would actually sit down and engage seriously and make some progress, but there's nothing on the public record to suggest that.
That's it, Ambassador Menon. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Winnie. Good to see you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.